I'm sitting here at 3:17 a.m. and I honestly can't stop shaking from what God just revealed to me about why innocent people suffer while evil seems to prosper in this world. I thought I had some understanding of suffering after portraying Christ and studying his passion, but what he showed me about the deeper purposes behind human suffering and the hidden reality of what's really happening when evil appears to win, it completely shattered every assumption I had about justice, fairness, and God's character. Wherever you're watching this right now, whether you're going through undeserved suffering, questioning God's goodness because of what you see in the world, or struggling with the age-old question of why bad things happen to good people, this message will either give you profound peace about God's justice, or it will challenge everything you thought you knew about how God operates in human affairs. But here's what I need you to understand before I share what I saw. This isn't about giving easy answers to complex questions or dismissing real pain with religious platitudes. This is about understanding God's heart in the midst of suffering and his perspective on what we call injustice. And honestly, after seeing what I've seen, I realize that what we perceive as God's absence in suffering is actually evidence of his deepest love and most profound purposes. It started 8 weeks ago when I received a letter that haunted me and wouldn't leave my mind. A woman named Rebecca wrote, "Jonathan, my 8-year-old daughter was killed by a drunk driver who walked away without a scratch. He had multiple DUI convictions and should have been in prison, but he was released early for good behavior. Meanwhile, my innocent baby is gone forever. I've been a faithful Christian my whole life, but I can't understand how God allows this. How can a loving God let innocent children die while evil people prosper? I'm losing my faith because nothing makes sense anymore." That letter hit me like a freight train. Here was a mother whose world had been destroyed by what seemed like the ultimate injustice, an innocent child killed while the guilty person suffered no consequences. And her question wasn't coming from intellectual curiosity, it was coming from the deepest anguish a human heart can experience. "But you know what really shook me?" Rebecca continued. "I look around the world and see this pattern everywhere. Corrupt politicians get richer while honest people lose their jobs. Child abusers walk free while their victims suffer for life. Dictators live in luxury while innocent people are murdered. Drug dealers prosper while their victims' families are destroyed. Where is God's justice? Where is his love? How can he call himself good when he allows such evil to flourish?" Honestly, I read that letter dozens of times, and each time it impacted me more deeply. Because Rebecca's questions weren't coming from rebellion or atheism and DSF, they were coming from a broken heart that genuinely wanted to understand how a good God could allow such apparent injustice. And that's when I knew I had to ask God directly, why do innocent people suffer while evil people prosper? What is the truth behind what appears to be cosmic injustice? How can God be both loving and sovereign when the world seems so unfair? You know what's incredible about these questions? They touch on the deepest philosophical and theological issues that have plagued humanity since the beginning of time. And honestly, what God showed me about the reality behind suffering and evil will either give you unshakable peace about his character or challenge you to trust him in ways you never have before. But here's where it gets bigger than just Rebecca's tragedy. Because as I was preparing to seek God's face about these questions, I started receiving similar messages from people all over the world who were struggling with the same issues. David wrote, "My business partner embezzled everything and destroyed my company, but he's living in a mansion while my family lost our home. How is this God's justice?" Sarah asked, "I've watched my godly parents suffer with cancer while our atheist neighbors live in perfect health and mock our faith. Where is God's fairness?" Michael confessed, "I've been faithful to God my whole life, but I've watched cheaters get promoted while I've been passed over repeatedly. I'm starting to wonder if being good is actually a disadvantage." Jennifer shared, "My daughter was sexually abused by a youth pastor who is now leading another church while she's in therapy. How can God allow his own representatives to destroy innocence?" Honestly, these messages revealed something that shocked me. Here were sincere believers who loved God but were genuinely struggling with what appeared to be his indifference to injustice and his allowance of innocent suffering. You know what struck me about every single message? These people weren't questioning whether God existed. They were questioning whether he was good, whether he cared, and whether his justice was real or just a comforting myth. And that's when I realized something bigger was happening here. God wasn't just stirring my heart to understand suffering, he was preparing to reveal something about his character and his ways that would transform how we understand justice, mercy, and his ultimate purposes forever. Wherever you are right now, I want you to feel the weight of this question settling on your heart. What if what we perceive as God's injustice is actually evidence of his perfect justice operating on a level we can't see? It was a Tuesday night when I finally worked up the courage to ask God these questions directly. I had been carrying them in my heart for weeks, honestly uncertain about what his answer might reveal about his character and his ways. You know those moments when you realize that some questions could change your entire relationship with God depending on the answer? This was one of those moments. I was in my prayer room, surrounded by all the letters from people struggling with suffering and injustice, when I fell to my knees and cried out with desperation I'd never felt before about this topic. God, I prayed, I need to understand your heart about suffering and injustice. Why do innocent people suffer while evil people prosper? Are you truly just? Do you truly care? I need to know the truth about your character and your ways, even if it's difficult to accept. You know what happened next? The presence of God filled my room with such overwhelming love and grief that I began weeping before he even spoke. But this wasn't just his comforting presence. This was the heart of a father who sees every injustice, feels every pain, and carries every burden while working out purposes that transcend human understanding. Jonathan, came a voice filled with both infinite love and profound sorrow that made my entire body tremble. You have asked me about suffering and injustice, and I will show you the truth that will either crush your human understanding or elevate your faith to new levels of trust. But prepare yourself. What you are about to learn will challenge everything you think you know about fairness, justice, and my character. Honestly, I thought I was prepared for his answer. But you know what? Nobody is prepared for what God is about to reveal about the reality behind human suffering. Look, God commanded, and I will show you what is really happening when innocent people suffer and evil appears to prosper, and you will understand why your perspective and mine are so different. Suddenly, it was as if I was seeing human events from God's eternal perspective, and what I saw made my heart overflow with both understanding and awe. I saw that what we call innocent suffering and evil prospering was actually part of a cosmic battle between good and evil that was playing out on multiple levels, physical, spiritual, and eternal, with purposes and outcomes that extended far beyond what human eyes could see. The first truth you must understand, God explained, is that there are no truly innocent people in a fallen world, and there are no truly prosperous evil people when viewed from eternity. I watched as God showed me the spiritual reality behind what we perceive as injustice. Look at what you call an innocent person suffering, God instructed. I saw a godly woman going through terrible persecution for her faith. From human perspective, she was completely innocent and undeserving of such treatment. But from God's perspective, I saw something incredible happening. Watch what this suffering is producing in her, God said. I saw her character being refined like gold in fire, her faith becoming unshakable, her love for me deepening beyond what would have been possible without the trial. I watched as her suffering was creating eternal rewards and spiritual maturity that would last forever. But more than that, God continued, look at what her suffering is accomplishing in others. I saw her testimony during suffering leading dozens of people to faith, her example of grace under pressure transforming her persecutors, and her story inspiring believers around the world to greater faithfulness. What appears to be meaningless suffering, God explained, is actually producing eternal purposes that far outweigh the temporary pain. But then God showed me what was really happening with those who appeared to be prospering in evil. Look at what you call evil prospering, God instructed. I saw a corrupt businessman who had cheated his way to wealth and success. From human perspective, he was getting away with evil and being rewarded for it. But from God's perspective, I saw something terrifying. Watch what his apparent prosperity is really costing him, God said. I saw his soul becoming darker with each evil choice, his capacity for love and joy dying, his relationships becoming hollow and meaningless. I watched as his temporary gains were actually eternal losses that would last forever. But more than that, God continued, look at what I am preparing for him. I saw the perfect justice that awaited him. Not just punishment, but the natural consequences of choosing evil over good, darkness over light, selfishness over love. What appears to be evil prospering, God explained, is actually evil storing up judgment while being given opportunity to repent. But then God showed me the most crucial truth about suffering and justice. Look at the bigger picture, God commanded. I saw that every instance of suffering and apparent injustice was part of a larger story that was unfolding across time and eternity, with purposes and outcomes that human minds couldn't fully comprehend, but that demonstrated perfect love and perfect justice. The suffering of the innocent serves purposes you cannot see, God explained. The prosperity of the evil serves justice you cannot yet understand, and both are working together for good that transcends human perspective. I watched as God showed me specific examples of how apparent injustices were actually serving his ultimate purposes of redemption, refinement, and revelation. "Look at the cross," God said with intensity that made my heart stop. I saw the ultimate example of innocent suffering, IPSI, Jesus, the only truly innocent person who ever lived, suffering the most unjust death in human history while his murderers appeared to prosper. From human perspective, God explained, the cross was the greatest injustice ever committed. But from my perspective, it was the greatest act of love and justice ever accomplished. I watched as Jesus' innocent suffering accomplished the redemption of humanity, the defeat of evil, and the demonstration of God's love and justice in ways that nothing else could have achieved. Every instance of innocent suffering, God continued, participates in the same redemptive purposes that were accomplished through Christ's suffering. But you know what God showed me next that will either give you incredible peace or challenge everything you believe about fairness? I will show you the hidden reality behind what you perceive as injustice, God said. I watched as God revealed the spiritual dimensions of suffering and evil that human eyes cannot see, and honestly, what I saw completely transformed my understanding of God's character and his ways. The truth about suffering, God explained, will either crush your human expectations or elevate your faith to trust me beyond what you can understand. And honestly, what God revealed next about the deeper purposes behind innocent suffering and the hidden reality of divine justice will either give you unshakable confidence in his goodness or challenge you to trust him in ways that transcend human logic. Now I will show you the hidden reality behind every instance of suffering and apparent injustice, God said with an intensity that made my spirit tremble. Because, Jonathan, what humans perceive as my absence in suffering is actually evidence of my deepest involvement in purposes that transcend temporal understanding. The truth about why I allow innocent suffering while evil appears to prosper will either destroy your human concepts of fairness or establish your faith on unshakable foundations. You know what happened next? God began revealing the specific spiritual realities operating behind every instance of suffering and injustice, and honestly, what he showed me was both incredibly profound and deeply challenging. This wasn't about explaining away pain or minimizing real injustice, but about understanding the eternal purposes and hidden dimensions that make suffering meaningful and justice certain. The first reality you must understand, God explained, is that I experience every moment of innocent suffering more intensely than the sufferer themselves. I watched as God showed me his heart during instances of what appeared to be senseless suffering, and what I saw made me weep uncontrollably. Look at my heart when Rebecca's daughter was killed, God instructed. I saw the moment of that tragic accident from God's perspective, and I was overwhelmed by the grief, anger, and love that filled his heart. He wasn't distant or indifferent. He was experiencing the pain more deeply than even the mother because he loved that child with perfect love. I felt every moment of that child's fear, God said with anguish that shook the heavens. I carried every ounce of the mother's grief. I experienced every injustice of the drunk driver's choices. Nothing about that tragedy escaped my notice or failed to move my heart. But then God showed me what was happening in the spiritual realm during that tragedy. Watch what I was doing in the midst of apparent injustice, God instructed. I saw angels surrounding that child in her final moments, carrying her instantly into the presence of perfect love and joy. I watched as her brief life on earth was transformed into eternal glory that far exceeded anything she could have experienced in a fallen world. That child's suffering lasted moments, God explained, but her joy will last forever. The injustice she experienced was temporary, but the justice I will provide is eternal. I saw the drunk driver's apparent escape from consequences, but I also saw the spiritual reality, his soul becoming darker, his conscience being seared, and perfect justice being prepared for him, unless he repented. What appears to be evil prospering, God continued, is actually evil being given rope to hang itself while being offered opportunities for redemption. But the second reality God revealed was even more profound. Every instance of innocent suffering serves purposes that extend far beyond the individual experience, God said. I watched as God showed me how individual suffering was connected to larger purposes of redemption, revelation, and transformation that affected countless other lives. Look at what Rebecca's tragedy is accomplishing, God instructed. I saw how her daughter's death and her mother's grief were creating ripple effects that would impact thousands of lives. Rebecca's struggle with faith was leading her to a deeper understanding of God's character that would eventually help other grieving parents. Her story was causing people to examine their own mortality and relationship with God. Her daughter's brief life was inspiring others to cherish their children more deeply. But more than that, God continued, watch what this suffering is producing in the eternal realm. I saw how Rebecca's pain was creating intercession in heaven, how her daughter's innocence was adding to the testimony against evil, and how their story was contributing to the ultimate defeat of injustice and death. No suffering is wasted, God explained with passion. Every tear is collected, every injustice is recorded, and every pain serves purposes that will be revealed when I make all things new. But then God showed me something that completely revolutionized my understanding of evil's apparent prosperity. Look at what really happens when evil appears to prosper, God instructed. I watched a corrupt politician who had gained power through lies and manipulation. From human perspective, he was succeeding and being rewarded for his evil. But from God's perspective, I saw something entirely different. Watch what his success is actually costing him, God said. I saw his soul becoming increasingly dark and empty with each corrupt choice. His capacity for genuine love, joy, and peace was dying. His relationships were becoming hollow performances. His conscience was being seared beyond feeling. His connection to everything good and beautiful was being severed. What humans call prosperity, God explained, is actually spiritual poverty when it's built on evil. What appears to be success is actually the progressive death of everything that makes life meaningful. But more shocking was what God showed me about the ultimate fate of those who prosper through evil. Look at the justice that awaits them, God instructed. I saw the perfect judgment that would eventually come to every person who chose evil over good, not just punishment, but the natural consequences of rejecting love, truth, and righteousness. I watched as their temporary gains became eternal losses, their momentary pleasures became endless regret, and their apparent victories became ultimate defeat. My justice is not absent, God said with authority that shook creation. My justice is being stored up. Every evil deed is recorded, every injustice is noted, and every wrong will be made right in my perfect timing. The third reality was the most challenging to human understanding. I allow suffering and apparent injustice because preventing them would require removing human freedom, which would destroy the very love I am seeking to create, God explained. I watched as God showed me the cosmic tension between his desire to prevent suffering and his commitment to genuine love and relationship. Look at what would happen if I prevented all suffering and injustice, God instructed. I saw a world where God intervened to stop every evil choice, prevent every harmful consequence, and protect every innocent person. But in that world, I also saw that human choices became meaningless, love became programmed, and relationship with God became robotic rather than genuine. Love requires freedom, God explained with grief. Freedom allows evil. Evil causes suffering. But without this possibility, love cannot exist, relationship cannot be real, and the ultimate good I am working toward cannot be achieved. I watched as God showed me how he was working within the constraints of human freedom to bring about the greatest possible good while allowing the least possible evil. Every instance of suffering I allow serves the greater purpose of creating genuine love and relationship, God continued. The temporary pain serves eternal joy. The momentary injustice serves ultimate justice. The apparent evil serves the triumph of good. But the fourth reality was the most hopeful. I am working all things together for good, even when humans cannot see how, God said. I watched as God showed me how he was taking every instance of suffering and injustice and weaving them into a tapestry of redemption that would ultimately demonstrate his perfect love and justice. Look at how I work through suffering to accomplish good, God instructed. I saw how persecution was strengthening the church, how injustice was creating hunger for righteousness, how suffering was producing character and compassion, and how apparent defeats were setting up ultimate victories. In Nazi Germany, God showed me, the suffering of my people led to the exposure and defeat of evil, the strengthening of faith worldwide, and the establishment of Israel as a nation. In communist countries, I watched, persecution purified the church, created unshakable faith, and ultimately led to the collapse of atheistic systems. In personal tragedies I saw, suffering was producing testimonies that led others to faith, character that reflected my nature, and eternal rewards that far exceeded temporal losses. I am not the author of evil, God explained, but I am the master of redemption. I take what evil intends for harm and transform it into good that exceeds what would have existed without the suffering. The fifth reality was the most eternal in perspective. What humans experience as a lifetime of suffering or prosperity is less than a moment compared to eternity, God said. I watched as God showed me the eternal perspective on temporal suffering and injustice, and what I saw completely changed how I understood the significance of earthly experiences. Look at time from my perspective, God instructed. I saw human life as a brief flash compared to eternity, like a single frame in an endless movie, a single note in an eternal symphony, a single brushstroke in an infinite masterpiece. The longest human suffering, God explained, is momentary compared to eternal joy. The greatest earthly injustice is insignificant compared to eternal justice. The most successful evil is temporary compared to eternal good. I watched as people who had suffered greatly on earth were experiencing joy in eternity that made their earthly pains seem like a distant, brief shadow. I saw those who had prospered through evil facing eternal consequences that made their temporal gains seem like worthless trinkets. What matters is not what happens in the brief moment of earthly life, God continued, but what those experiences produce for eternity. Suffering that produces eternal character is infinitely valuable. Prosperity that produces eternal loss is infinitely tragic. But you know what God showed me about the ultimate resolution of all suffering and injustice? I will make all things new, God said with power that made creation itself tremble with anticipation. Every tear will be wiped away, every wrong will be made right, every injustice will be corrected, and every suffering will be redeemed. I watched as God showed me the coming restoration, where all the apparent contradictions of earthly life would be resolved in perfect justice and love. Look at the final resolution, God instructed. I saw a new heaven and new earth where suffering no longer existed, where justice reigned perfectly, where love was complete, and where every question about God's goodness would be answered by the overwhelming evidence of His perfect character. Those who suffered innocently will be rewarded beyond measure, God explained. Those who caused suffering will face perfect justice. Those who endured faithfully will reign eternally. Those who chose evil will experience the full consequences of their choices. I watched as every person who had ever questioned God's justice during earthly suffering fell on their faces in worship when they saw the perfect wisdom, love, and justice of His ways. The temporary mystery of suffering, God said, will be replaced by eternal clarity of purpose. The momentary questions about my goodness will be answered by everlasting demonstrations of my perfect love. But you know what God told me about how we should respond to suffering and apparent injustice in light of these realities? Trust me when you cannot understand, God said with tenderness that melted my heart. Believe in my goodness when circumstances suggest otherwise. Hold fast to my character when experiences challenge your faith. Know that I am working all things together for good, even when you cannot see how. The suffering you experience or witness is real, God continued, but it is not the end of the story. The injustice you see is temporary, but my justice is eternal. The evil that appears to prosper is actually storing up judgment, while the good that suffers is storing up reward. Then God gave me the most crucial message about suffering and justice. Tell people that their pain matters to me. Their questions are valid and their struggles are seen, God said with love that encompassed all human suffering. But also tell them that my ways are higher than their ways, my thoughts are higher than their thoughts, and my love is deeper than their understanding. The truth about suffering will either crush their human expectations or establish their faith on eternal foundations, God explained. Those who trust me in the darkness will see the light. Those who believe in my goodness despite appearances will experience my goodness beyond measure. And honestly, what God revealed next about how individual believers should respond to suffering and injustice will either give you unshakable peace in trials or challenge you to trust Him beyond human understanding. Now I will show you exactly how every believer should respond to suffering and apparent injustice in light of what I have revealed, God said with an intensity that made my entire being tremble. Because, Jonathan, understanding the truth about suffering is not meant to be merely intellectual knowledge. It is meant to transform how my people live, trust, and respond when they encounter pain and injustice. Every believer who applies these truths will find unshakable peace in trials and become a source of hope for others who are struggling. You know what happened next? God began revealing the specific ways that believers should respond to suffering and injustice based on the eternal realities He had shown me, and honestly, what He revealed was both incredibly practical and deeply transformative. This wasn't just about understanding suffering theoretically, this was about living with faith and hope in the midst of real pain and apparent injustice. The first way believers should respond to suffering, God explained, is by choosing to trust my character even when they cannot understand my ways. I watched as God showed me believers around the world who were facing terrible trials but who were choosing to anchor their faith in God's character rather than their circumstances. Look at Maria in Colombia, God instructed. I saw a woman whose husband had been murdered by drug dealers, leaving her alone with 3 young children in poverty. From every human perspective, this was senseless tragedy and injustice. But I watched Maria's response to her suffering. God, I heard her pray through tears. I don't understand why this happened, and I can't see any good in it right now. But I know you are good. I know you love me, and I know you love my children. I choose to trust your character even when I can't understand your ways. I saw how Maria's choice to trust God's character despite her circumstances was creating supernatural peace in her heart and strength to care for her children. Her faith wasn't based on her ability to explain her suffering, but on her knowledge of God's unchanging goodness. Every time Maria chooses trust over doubt, God explained with joy, she is demonstrating the kind of faith that transforms suffering into testimony and pain into purpose. But then, God showed me what happened when other believers followed Maria's example. Watch the multiplication effect, God instructed. I saw Maria's neighbors being amazed by her peace in the midst of tragedy. Her children were learning to trust God through watching their mother's faith. Other widows were finding hope through her example. Her testimony was leading people to faith who had never considered God's love before. This is happening around the world, God said with excitement. Every believer who chooses to trust my character in suffering becomes a light that draws others to faith and hope. I watched as God showed me practical ways that any believer could choose trust over doubt in suffering. When you face unexplained pain, declare my goodness instead of questioning my love. When you see injustice, affirm my justice instead of doubting my character. When circumstances suggest I don't care, remember my demonstrated love at the cross. When you can't understand my ways, hold fast to what you know about my nature. When enough of my people respond to suffering with trust, God explained, they create a testimony that transforms how the world sees me and how they themselves experience trials. The second response God revealed was even more challenging. Believers should respond to suffering by looking for the purposes I am accomplishing through their pain, God said. I watched as God showed me believers who were actively seeking to understand how their suffering could serve God's purposes rather than simply enduring it passively. Look at Pastor John in Nigeria, God instructed. I saw a pastor whose church had been burned down by extremists and whose congregation had been scattered through persecution. Instead of becoming bitter or discouraged, I watched John's response to this injustice. Lord, I heard John pray, I don't like this suffering, but I want to understand what you're accomplishing through it. Show me how to cooperate with your purposes instead of just surviving this trial. I saw John beginning to see how the persecution was purifying his church, how the scattering was spreading the gospel to new areas, and how his response to injustice was creating a powerful testimony of God's sustaining grace. Every time John looks for my purposes in his suffering, God explained, he transforms from a victim of circumstances into a partner in my redemptive work. But then God showed me the incredible impact when believers actively cooperated with God's purposes in their suffering. Watch what happens when my people seek my purposes in their pain, God instructed. I saw believers around the world whose suffering was producing extraordinary spiritual fruit because they were actively looking for how God wanted to use their trials. Their pain was creating compassion for others, their injustice was producing hunger for righteousness, their losses were generating eternal perspective, and their trials were developing unshakable character. In China, God showed me, persecuted believers are seeing their suffering as preparation for ministry to other persecuted people around the world. In Africa, believers facing poverty are discovering that their dependence on me creates faith that wealthy believers struggle to develop. In America, believers going through trials are finding that their pain gives them credibility to minister to others in similar situations. I watched as this purposeful approach to suffering was creating some of the most powerful testimonies and effective ministries in the world. Every believer who seeks my purposes in their pain, God explained, discovers that suffering with purpose is infinitely more bearable than suffering without meaning. The third response was the most transformative. Believers should respond to injustice by becoming agents of my justice rather than passive victims of unfairness, God said. I watched as God showed me believers who were responding to injustice by actively working to bring about God's justice in the world, rather than simply complaining about unfairness. Look at Sarah in India, God instructed. I saw a woman who had been trafficked as a child and had experienced horrific injustice. But instead of remaining bitter about her suffering, I watched Sarah's response to the evil she had experienced. God, I heard Sarah pray, I can't change what happened to me, but I can work to prevent it from happening to other children. Use my pain to bring about your justice for others who are suffering the same injustice. I saw Sarah establishing safe houses for trafficked children, working with law enforcement to arrest traffickers, and creating programs to prevent vulnerable children from being exploited. Her response to injustice was creating justice for others. Every time Sarah works for justice instead of wallowing in injustice, God explained, she transforms her suffering into a force for good that prevents others from experiencing similar pain. But then God showed me what happened when believers around the world began responding to injustice by becoming agents of justice. Watch the global impact, God instructed. I saw believers everywhere who had experienced injustice becoming passionate advocates for justice in their spheres of influence. Those who had been cheated were working to create honest business practices. Those who had been abused were establishing protection for other victims. Those who had experienced discrimination were fighting for equality and fairness. When my people respond to injustice by creating justice, God explained, they participate in my work of making all things right and demonstrate my heart for righteousness to the world. The fourth response was the most supernatural. Believers should respond to suffering by allowing it to increase their compassion and ministry to others who are hurting, God said. I watched as God showed me believers whose suffering had created extraordinary capacity for ministering to others in pain. Look at the support group in Texas, God instructed. I saw a group of parents who had all lost children to various tragedies. Instead of allowing their grief to isolate them, I watched how they had come together to support other grieving parents. We can't bring our children back, I heard their leader say, but we can help other parents survive what we've survived. Our pain gives us credibility and compassion that no one else can offer. I saw how their shared suffering had created a ministry that was literally saving the lives of other grieving parents who were considering suicide. Their pain was being transformed into healing for others. Every time these parents use their suffering to help others, God explained, they discover that shared pain becomes multiplied healing and that their losses create gains for others. But then God showed me what happened when this principle was applied globally. Listen to the testimonies that are rising from my people worldwide, God instructed. I heard believers everywhere who were using their suffering as qualification for ministry to others in similar situations. Former addicts were helping current addicts. Cancer survivors were encouraging current patients. Abuse survivors were counseling current victims. Divorced people were supporting others going through divorce. When my people allow suffering to increase their compassion, God explained, they create a network of healing that transforms pain into purpose and wounds into wisdom. The fifth response was the most eternal in perspective. Believers should respond to suffering by investing in eternal rewards rather than demanding temporal comfort, God said. I watched as God showed me believers who were using their suffering as motivation to store up treasures in heaven rather than seeking earthly compensation for their pain. Look at the missionary couple in Southeast Asia, God instructed. I saw a couple who had lost their life savings to a fraudulent investment scheme. Instead of becoming bitter or demanding justice, I watched their response to this financial injustice. Lord, I heard them pray, we can't recover our earthly losses, but we can invest what we have left in eternal rewards. Use this trial to redirect our focus from temporal security to eternal significance. I saw them using their reduced circumstances as motivation to trust God more completely and to focus their remaining resources on kingdom purposes. Their financial loss was creating spiritual gain that would last forever. Every time they choose eternal perspective over temporal comfort, God explained, they are storing up treasures in heaven that far exceed their earthly losses. But you know what God showed me about the ultimate result? when believers respond to suffering with these 5 approaches. Watch what happens when my people respond to suffering and injustice with trust, purpose-seeking, justice-creating, compassion increasing, and eternal perspective. God instructed. I saw believers around the world whose response to suffering was creating such powerful testimonies that entire communities were being transformed. Their faith in trials was more convincing than any sermon. Their peace in pain was more powerful than any argument. Their hope in injustice was more attractive than any promise of earthly prosperity. The world is watching how my people respond to suffering, God explained, and their response either validates or invalidates their claims about my goodness and power. Then God showed me the specific impact that proper responses to suffering were having globally. Look at the harvest that is coming from redeemed suffering, God instructed. I saw that some of the most powerful evangelism and church growth in the world was happening through believers who were responding to suffering with faith, hope, and love. Their testimonies were creating conversions that no amount of preaching alone could accomplish. In the Middle East, God showed me, persecuted Christians whose response to injustice demonstrates my love are leading their persecutors to faith. In Africa, believers whose response to poverty shows my provision are creating revival in their communities. In Asia, Christians whose response to suffering reveals my peace are drawing entire families to salvation. I watched as redeemed suffering was becoming one of the most powerful tools for advancing God's kingdom and demonstrating His character to a watching world. But you know what God's most urgent message was for every believer facing or witnessing suffering? Tell my people that their response to suffering is their greatest opportunity to demonstrate my reality to the world. God said with intensity that made me weep. How they handle pain, injustice, and trials will either validate or invalidate everything they claim to believe about me. Every believer who responds to suffering with faith instead of bitterness, purpose instead of despair, justice creating instead of victim mentality, compassion instead of self-pity, an eternal perspective instead of temporal focus becomes a living testimony to my goodness and power, God continued. Then God gave me the most specific instructions for believers who wanted to respond to suffering in ways that honor Him and help others. Starting today, God said, believers should, when facing unexplained suffering, declare my goodness and trust my character even when they cannot understand my ways. Actively look for the purposes I am accomplishing through their pain and cooperate with those purposes instead of just enduring trials. Respond to injustice by working to create justice for others rather than remaining passive victims of unfairness. Allow their suffering to increase their compassion and ministry to others who are hurting rather than becoming isolated in their pain. Use trials as motivation to invest in eternal rewards rather than demanding temporal comfort or earthly justice. The believers who respond to suffering in these ways, God explained, will not only find meaning and hope in their trials, they will become instruments of my grace that transform other people's understanding of suffering and my character. But you know what God's final message was that will either comfort you or challenge you. Suffering is not evidence of my absence, God said with passion that filled the heavens. Suffering is an opportunity for my presence to be demonstrated through my people's response to trials. The question is not why I allow suffering, but how my people will respond to the suffering I allow. Wherever you are right now, whether you're going through unexplained suffering, witnessing apparent injustice, or struggling to understand God's goodness in the midst of pain, know that your response to suffering is your greatest opportunity to demonstrate God's reality to the world. You can choose trust over doubt. You can seek purpose over despair. You can create justice over remaining a victim. You can increase compassion over becoming bitter. You can invest eternally over demanding temporal comfort. Every choice you make in suffering either validates or invalidates your faith. The question is not why God allows suffering. The question is how you will respond to the suffering God allows. Will you be crushed by trials, or will you be transformed through them? Will you become bitter about injustice, or will you become an agent of justice? Will your suffering create doubt, or will it create testimony? The choice is yours, but your response to suffering may be the most powerful sermon you ever preach. Trust Him when you cannot understand. Believe in His goodness when circumstances suggest otherwise. Know that He is working all things together for good, even when you cannot see how. Your pain has purpose. Your trials have meaning. Your suffering can become your greatest testimony to His goodness and grace.